got large people, so I'll try to project so you guys can hear me. But if at any point you can't hear me, just let me know. But welcome to the outskirts of our Powhatan town. What you're currently standing outside and around is what's known as a dance space circle. It's based off of a drawing by an Englishman named John White, who wasn't actually at the Jamestown colony, but was at the Roanoke colony, one of those previous colonies that Pat was talking about earlier. Are any of you folks familiar with the Roanoke colony at all? All right, excellent. What can you tell us about, sir?
It was founded earlier, but as I recall, they don't know what happened to it. It disappeared.
It did. It
All
was,
the people.
yeah, it was kind of known as the lost colony of Roanoke. It's in what's now North Carolina in the Outer Banks. Back then it was called Virginia, unless you were Spanish, which all of this area was called Florida. But you're absolutely right. It was kind of lost. The leaders had to go back to England to go procure supplies. Among those people was John White. And when he got back, the colony was missing. The most likely scenario is it went to go live with some of the other tribes, but it was never found. However, those documents that he brought back with him were of great use to both us as anthropologists and also as helpful to the Jamestown colonists. But they did show a lot of people doing things of the native population, and part of those, one of those drawings, I should say, included this circle. It showed people dancing inside and around in rings for a ceremony of some kind, as he says, but he doesn't really tell us the details that much. Doesn't tell us what the faces represent, doesn't tell us why they're dancing, what kind of music would have been playing. All those details that we would love to know about this circle are lost to us, and unfortunately might never be known. And that's part of the reason why we have it, to help show that we don't always have all those facts about the past, and in some cases never will. But this modern recreation was carved for us by the leader of the Pamunkey, one of the many tribes that were once part of the Powhatan chiefdom. And whenever we talk about the Powhatan, we kind of talk about them as a single group. But actually it was a combination of over 30 individual tribes, each with their own chief called a Werewance or a Werewansqua, a male or a female chief, and they'd be under the leadership of a greater chief called a Mamanitoic. And the Mamanitoic, when the English arrive, calls himself Powhatan, hence the Powhatan chiefdom. But he had actually inherited 6 of those tribes from his mother, who was the previous Mamanitoic, and then expanded by means of military might and political diplomacy. But when the English arrived, they settled smack dab in the center of it, and some of those tribes are at different odds as to how to deal with them. Some of them, especially when the English first land, shoot at them right off the bat and start to attack them. Others try to leave them alone, and still others want to trade with them. And that becomes the policy for the first couple of years. Powhatan really likes trading with the English. They have a lot of cool stuff. Things like metal tools and copper and beads. Stuff that the Powhatan don't really need, but stuff they might want. Whereas the English, on the other hand, need certain things from the Powhatan. They need stuff to send back to England to sell, to try to make a profit. And so they start trading for things like furs. And they also, most importantly, need food. And that becomes a problem in 1609 when there is a drought. And that drought causes there to be a loss of food for both the English and the Powhatan. And the Powhatan aren't as willing to trade away the food. So do the English give up and go home? No, what do they do then?
Attacking Garrett.
They take the food, exactly. They start raiding Powhatan towns. And they raid these towns throughout the year, and the Powhatan respond. They don't just take it sitting down. They respond by laying James Fort under siege during the winter of 1609 and 1610. And that siege is what we now generally call the starving time. The siege kind of forced the English to stay put, and they start to starve. And those that survive were almost willing to give back and go back to England. But they get reinforced in the spring, and that leads into a war between the two people until 1614, when a certain person rolls around that you've probably heard of before. Has anyone here heard of Pocahontas?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so some of you have heard of her. Pocahontas, when the English first arrived, she's very young, actually. She's only about 9 or 10-ish. We're not entirely certain. But she becomes friends with John Smith. And that friendship is purely platonic in nature, despite what the Disney movie might have you think. The friendship between them kind of helps to bridge that early gap and get some of the trading going on early on. But come 1614, she's quite a bit older. In fact, she's captured by the English and brought back to the fort and held hostage. What ends up happening is she ends up converting to Christianity there and marries a gentleman named John Rolfe, who's the person that brings tobacco to the colony. And you might hear a little bit more about him in the fort. But that marriage kind of is a peace treaty in a sense. It actually kind of physically, not physically, but it is a symbolic end to the war. And she ends up going to England, where she will have a son and then die 2 years later. And then 2 years after that, Powhatan himself dies in 1618. And with his death, the Powhatan chiefdom doesn't just fall apart. It's actually inherited by his younger brother, Opicapam. Now, unfortunately, a lot is not known about Opicapam. Of what I've been able to find out, he seems to oftentimes be compared to his older brother and trying to fill those shoes in a sense. But what we do know is that he's eventually replaced with his even younger brother, Opechancanough. And Opechancanough is a person that we know a fair bit about. He was one of the war leaders under Powhatan, and now he's the Mamanitoic. And the way he sees it, the only way for the Powhatan to kind of survive is to fight back. So he organizes an uprising against the English in 1622 to try to take them by surprise, try to kill as many of the English as possible on a single day. But James Fort itself gets spared, and for one reason or another, it leads into another war with the Powhatan, this one lasting for a whole 10 years. And then he tries it again in 1644. This one lasts even less amount of time, when he is actually captured by the English and then executed. And he's rather up there in age by the time he's captured and executed, somewhere in his 80s or 90s. Again, we're not entirely certain on ages. But with his death, the Powhatan chiefdom basically eventually falls apart. Each of those tribes that we talked about make their kind of separate pieces, and some of those tribes are placed onto reservations. In fact, two of the oldest reservations in the country are that of the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey, and they are still around to this day. There are currently 8 tribes that were once part of the Powhatan chiefdom that are recognized by the state of Virginia. However, none of them have any federal recognition. But we do try to keep in contact with them as best as we can to make sure what we present here is accurate in their eyes, as well as in the eyes of historians and archaeologists. But a lot of what we know about the Powhatan, a lot of what I've just told you, is a lot of political history, a lot of what's happened from a political perspective. But some of what we know about the Powhatan is just their domestic life, what took place on a day-to-day basis that the English found interesting enough to write down. And a lot of that took place in these houses called Yahakans. So we're going to go inside one now and check it out, see if we can fit you guys in there. If not, we'll try to walk through.